In this exercise, we're going to practice a bunch of things, including cleaning up data, of course, pivot tables. We have to do that, right? Importing data. And we're going to use some data from Minnesota Death Certificates database. These are records for people who died from an opioid-related death. So it's a subset of the full death certificate database. It includes deaths that occurred between 2006 and 2017. Here you can see from the record layout some of the fields of information that are included. There's actually two page, cause A and cause B are on the next page. But so there's like some cause of death information. There's where they died, information about them, race, gender, ethnicity, age, whether they were in the armed forces, occupation, industry, all kinds of interesting pieces of information about the people who died. So that's what we're going to be working with today. We're going to start with importing data. So let's go open up Excel and get a blank workbook. And I'm going to do the importing on the legacy, using the legacy import wizard, since that is the most common you'll find in a Mac. If you're in, so I'm on a Windows machine. And so this might look a little different on a Mac. The import is one of the big things that is different. But you should have a way to get data, import data from text CSV. I'm going to get data legacy wizard from text legacy. Go back to the importing video if you need to make sure to see how to do that. Okay, so I'm going to find my file. And I'm going to import opioid deaths data .csv. It's delimited with commas. My data has headers. Make sure that that is marked. Say next. It is comma delimited, not tab, so uncheck tab. And the data preview is looking pretty good. Say next, and then here you want to make sure things are set the way you want. I would look carefully for things like zip codes. You'd want those set as text. The dates, what happened to their birth date and death date. You want that as a date, and here you can choose what the date format is in the underlying data. Month, day, year is the obviously most common in the U.S. I think age years should work on its own. It'll default to a numeric. So we want to make sure that happens. Here's another zip code. It defaulted to text, it looks like. I think those are the only other ones we need to worry about. So say finish, and it's going to ask you where you want it. A1 in this worksheet sounds good. Okay, there we go. So now it's in, but we need to save it as Excel. So file, save as. I'm going to call it opioids. And find a place to save it and say save. Okay, so we have our data here. I'm going to rename my sheet to call it data, just to remind myself that I have data in here. The first thing, so we've got that done. Let's now look for problems in our data or explore our data. It's a good idea to, you can do one of two things. One is you can turn on your filters and you can just start looking at some of these fields you really care about. So for example, gender, if you pull down on the filter, it shows you the a unique instance of each value that's in that column. We have F and M, female and male. Nothing, there's no blanks here, there's no unusual things. That's great. Let's look at race. Oh boy, lots of stuff here, lots of variation. This is not as well standardized, but we're going to work on that. Hispanic ethnicity. This is very clean, Hispanic, not Hispanic, or unknown. Age years should just be some numbers. And you can see we cover the whole spectrum of age. So go ahead and do that throughout the data set and see what you find, and get some familiarity with what's here, what's filled in, what's not filled in, what kinds of questions you can possibly ask the data. Let's start with this race column, cleaning it up. One thing, of course, is that Hispanic is listed separately than non-Hispanic. You can see here's someone who identifies their race is identified as white and their ethnicity as Hispanic. This is how the Census Bureau defines people. But what if generally under the race category, but they also do combine data and say, here's all the people who are Hispanic, here's all the people who are white, not Hispanic, for example. So we may want to combine these two things, and that might be the first place to start. So let's add a new column in here. I'm going to put a new column right after Hispanic ethnicity. Right mouse click, insert, and we're going to call this new race. And what we can do is say if Hispanic ethnicity equals Hispanic, then let's put that in this column. If it doesn't, then we'll put whatever is in the race column. And granted, we got some more work to do on race, but we'll come back to that. So if K2 equals Hispanic, and you got to make sure you put it in capital letters because that's how it appears in the data, then we'll take whatever is in K2. You could also just type the word Hispanic if you want, but I'm going to make it easy on myself and just type K2. And then the false part is J2, whatever's left. So it's a nice, easy, simple if statement. Copy this down. We should go down here to the one that was white Hispanic. You'll see now they are listed as Hispanic. You should make sure it went all the way down the page. There we go, all the way to the bottom. You can see here's some more that converted. All right, so our new race column is really race and Hispanic ethnicity combined. We're going to highlight this column and do copy, paste special values. So we get rid of the formula once we're sure it looks good. Now, let's do a pivot table and see what this looks like now. So insert pivot table and choose new race. If you don't see new race here for some reason, you can go up to pivot table analyze and choose refresh. But it should be there, say new race. And we don't need to count anything, but you can put new race back in the count to see what we have. So the most alarming thing to me here is that we have an African American category. We have a handful of multiracial categories that are each distinct from each other. But then the most alarming part is we have the Asians are split up into separate groups. So we have Asian Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, other Asian, Vietnamese. If the other groups are not split up in those cultural buckets the same way, and so then there's that creates an inconsistency. It also makes it hard to marry this to census data if we wanted to do per capita rates for these groups. You want it to try to match your census data as much as possible. And what they really do is Black, American Indian, Asian, white, other race, and then multiracial is how they do it. So what we can do is we can clean this up. And the easiest way to do that is to take the information from this pivot table. So I'm going to highlight the white part, just the words. We don't need the count. And copy this and put it into a new sheet. So I'm going to leave one space for a header. So this is the original, and we're not going to touch that. Don't mess with that column at all. Like, leave it exactly the way it is, because we're going to use Vlookup to match back to the main table and assign a cleaned up race. I'll call this clean race in this new column. So you can go in here and adjust these to what you want them to be. I'm I'm going to put all the ones that say multi-race as called multi, and we're going to, well, here's our chance to deal with capitalization as well. Whoops, I didn't want Korean, I want Asian, other, unknown, Asian, white, and multi. So once you have that ready to go, then let's give this sheet a name. We'll call it Race Lookup. You can also do the define, use right mouse click and choose define name, and define this as a named range, which will, I'm going to call it Race Lookup, and you want to make sure its scope is the whole workbook, and that it's the refers to is covering this whole area, A1 to B17. So say OK. So now when we go back to our data, we can put in another new column. So we have new race. We'll put in another new column, and I'm going to call this one clean race. And we can say, we can do a Vlookup. So you should have already done these in the earlier exercise, but this is a good practice for you. So Vlookup, and this time it's on the new race, and then our lookup is called Race Lookup, and then we want the second column from that, and we want false because this is an exact match. And there is our cleaned up race. I'm going to say control period to make sure it went to the bottom. And then I'm going to do one more thing. Let's turn on the filters and just make sure there are no blanks in here and that it looks, you can here in the filter, you can see what you have and it should look good. Okay, so I can do a copy paste special values, and we're good to go. Now you have these old columns here. I never recommend deleting. I think it's a bad practice. But if you want them out of your way, you can highlight all three columns up here by dragging across the letters, and then right mouse click and choose hide, and it will hide them from your sheet. You'll notice now that our sheet jumps from I to M, so you can see that there's hidden ones in there. If you ever need to unhide them, you highlight the two columns before and after your hidden columns, and then right mouse click and choose unhide to bring them back. Okay, so that now we have a new clean race column, and that will allow us to do, so we could do a quick insert pivot table, and let's see what our, oh look, so clean race is not showing up in my list. So I'm going to go up to pivot table analyze, choose refresh. There it is. Put that in the rows. We can also put it in the values. It's going to count the rows so we can see how many there are in each category. I'm going to click on count of clean race in the value box and choose value field settings. Go to the tab for show values as. Change it to % of grand total. So we can see that about 80% of the deaths were white people, 2% Hispanic, almost 9% Black, less than 1% Asian, and 7% American Indian. So the way you would understand whether these are big numbers or small numbers is to compare them to your, in this case, the state of Minnesota's population. American Indians make up 1% of the state's population, yet they make up 7% of these deaths. So that's a huge disparity. The Black group is also a little bit disparate. They make up about 6% of the population statewide. If you were to focus just on the metro area and look at only metro area deaths, I suspect it might be a little bit different picture. They're more concentrated in the metro area. But still, this is a little bit of a disparity. The huge disparity, though, here is American Indian. Okay, let's go back to our data. One of the other questions I would like to know is what's the patterns regarding age? Right now we have age expressed in years. And if we do this as a pivot table, what you're going to find is that you just get a whole bunch of numbers, almost every age across the whole spectrum, and it really doesn't tell us much. What we really need is for these people to be grouped by age. So I'm going to delete this pivot table. It's not going to be any use to us. So it would be better if we had an age grouping instead. So one of the things I like to do is to make a lookup table that groups into ages. And I've already done that for you. If you go to the data files I provided to you, there should be a file called opioid lookup tables. And if you open that up, there's one of the sheets is called age lookup. So you can see what I've done here is I've created a row for each group that I want. In column C, I've given it the label that I want to use for my groups. I've also gathered the population data in case we eventually want to do a per capita rate by age. And then this is the crucial thing we need for the VLOOKUP. We need the start age and the end age. Well, really, we need the start age of each group. That's the most crucial. You don't necessarily need the end age, but if you look carefully in this sheet, you'll see how I made this pivot, this sheet. It's all formulas. Basically, just by starting with 0 and 14, and then I said the start one on the next one is 14 plus 1, B4 plus 1, and this is A5 plus 4. So I created it, these 5-year age ranges without having to type all of it. And the age group is actually a concatenation of the information from the start and the end. So take a look at that. It's a clever little trick. I'm going to copy this and put it back in our actual data file. I'm going to make a new sheet and paste it in. So we'll call this age lookup. And like we did with the other one, we can define the name. So we have less typing. I'm going to call it age lookup. Make sure the scope is workbook and say OK. So now we have our lookup. Now we can go back to our data. So we'll put a new column in here after age years, and we'll call this age group. Okay, so now how do we get this in here? When we've done the VLOOKUPs in the other exercises, we did exact match, where we said 23 matches exactly with 23, for example. Here, we need Excel to figure out which bucket it needs to go in. So where would 23 go, for example? Well, it's bigger than 0, bigger than 14, bigger than 15, bigger than 19, bigger than 20, but smaller than 24. So it will, and smaller than 25. Really what's going to happen is it's going to hit the 20 and say, oh, it's bigger than 20. And then it's going to hit the 25 and say, oh, it's smaller than 25. That means it must go in the 20 to 24 bucket. So what we tell it is we have it look at this start column really is what it does, and it does that kind of those calculations to figure out where it needs to fall. So our VLOOKUP is going to be fairly similar. Well, first of all, your lookup, that start column needs to be the leftmost column of your lookup table. In this case, the column we want to transfer is our third column in our lookup table, so we need to remember that. All right, so let's go to work on our pivot table, our VLOOKUP here. So VLOOKUP, and we want to look up N2, which is the age, and then we have our age lookup is the table we're going to look it up in. We want to grab the third column, and then here's where we want to put the word true instead of the word false. So we want approximate match. And then Excel is going to do its work. Here, I'll make this formula a little bigger for you to see it. There you go. So VLOOKUP N2, comma age lookup, comma 3, comma true. And sure enough, 20 to 24. You copy it down, make sure it went all the way down. Let's turn on the filters and make sure we don't have any problematic ones. Nice, that looks beautiful. All right, so now we have age groups. Now we could do another pivot table on that age. Our age group is not missing, is missing, so we hit refresh. Age group. We can pull that down to values to count. There's our counts of each one. You could see it makes a little. We can insert a quick chart. You could see it. It's a little bit of, not quite a bell curve, but it's heavily. No, it's not a bell curve. It's tilted to the young people, which is not surprising.